Good evening. Picture this. A 17-year-old peasant girl, clad in white armor that gleams like starlight against the smoke-choked battlefield of Orleans. Her banner flutters in the wind as arrows whistle past her ears and the screams of dying men echo across the blood-soaked earth. This girl, who just months before was tending sheep and spinning wool in a backwater village, now commands armies and speaks directly to kings. Her name, Joan of Arc. And in just 2 short years, she would be burned alive as a heretic, her teenage body consumed by flames, while a crowd of thousands watched and cheered. Tonight, we're diving deep into one of history's most brutal and beautiful stories. How a peasant girl convinced a desperate king to hand her an army. How she turned the tide of a century-long war with nothing but unwavering faith and an unshakable belief that God himself was speaking directly into her ear. How the very men who crowned her a hero would ultimately betray her to the flames. This is the story of Joan of Arc, a tale so violent, so tragic, and so impossibly heroic that if you wrote it as fiction, no one would believe it. We'll explore the voices that drove her to greatness, the political machinations that destroyed her, and the brutal reality of medieval warfare that shaped every moment of her short, extraordinary life. From the mud and blood of 15th century France to the theological courtrooms where learned men debated whether this teenage girl was a saint or a witch, we'll uncover why Joan of Arc's life was nothing short of a beautiful nightmare. Joan claimed to hear voices at all hours, divine whispers that guided her every move. So tell me, where are you watching this from and what time is it? Drop a comment below because I'm genuinely curious about our global audience. And while you're at it, hit that subscribe button, because unlike Joan's judges, we won't condemn you for listening to strange voices, especially if those voices tell you to watch more history documentaries. The year is 1412, and France is dying. Not metaphorically, literally. The 100 Years' War has been raging for 3/4 of a century, turning what was once the jewel of medieval Europe into a charnel house. English armies have been carving through French territory like a hot knife through butter, leaving behind a trail of burned villages, empty fields, and mass graves that stretch from Normandy to the Loire Valley. In this hellscape of endless violence, a girl is born in the village of Domremy. Her name is Joan d'Arc, though history would remember her as Joan Domremy, sits right on the border between territories loyal to the French crown and those controlled by the Anglo-Burgundian alliance. In other words, baby Joan's first lullabies were probably the distant sounds of screaming and the crackle of burning thatch. Joan's parents, Jacques d'Arc and Isabelle Romy, were what we might call middle-class peasants. They owned their own land, which in medieval terms made them practically aristocrats among the dirt-poor masses. Jacques was even important enough to collect taxes for the local lord, which meant he was either very trusted or very unlucky, considering tax collectors in wartime had a life expectancy somewhere between that of a mayfly and a kamikaze pilot. The France of Joan's childhood was a country that existed more in theory than in practice. The official king, Charles VII, controlled maybe a third of what was supposed to be his kingdom. The rest belonged to Henry VI of England, who also claimed the French throne, because apparently one crown wasn't enough for some people. Meanwhile, the powerful Duke of Burgundy played both sides like a medieval arms dealer, switching loyalties whenever it suited his bank account. For a peasant child growing up in this chaos, life was about survival, not dreams. Joan learned to read, which was unusual for a girl of her class. She could spin, weave, and manage a household. She was described as pious, attending mass regularly and confessing her sins with the dedication of someone who genuinely believed hell was a real place where she might actually end up. In short, she was a perfectly normal medieval teenage girl, right up until she wasn't. It was around 1425, when Joan was 13, that the voices started. Not metaphorical voices, not the voice of conscience or intuition, real voices. as clear and distinct as if someone was standing right next to her. The first was Saint Michael the Archangel, the warrior saint who had cast Satan out of heaven. He appeared to her in her father's garden, surrounded by a blinding light that made the sun look like a candle. Now, let's pause here for a moment of medieval context. In the 15th century, religious visions weren't exactly rare. Saints, angels, and demons popped up in people's lives with the regularity of Netflix notifications. The difference was that most visionaries were either already religious figures or ended up in monasteries. They didn't usually receive detailed military intelligence from celestial beings. But Joan's voices were different. Saint Michael was soon joined by Saint Margaret and Saint Catherine, both virgin martyrs who had died rather than compromise their faith. These weren't gentle, comforting, spiritual encounters. Her voices gave her specific, practical instructions. They told her about the siege of Orleans. They gave her the name of the man who would become her sword-bearer. They even told her where to find a sword that had been lost for centuries. The voices told Joan something that would change the course of European history. She was to go to the Dauphin, the uncrowned prince who claimed to be the rightful king of France, and convince him to give her an army. With this army, she would lift the siege of Orleans, see Charles crowned king in Rheims Cathedral, and drive the English out of France entirely. To understand just how insane this plan sounded, imagine a 13-year-old farm girl from rural Nebraska announcing that Jesus had personally instructed her to march on Washington, convince the president to give her command of the US military, and single-handedly end whatever war happened to be going on at the time. That's essentially what Joan was claiming, except her world was even more brutal and unforgiving than ours. The voices weren't gentle suggestions, they were commands, delivered with divine authority. Saint Michael told her that God had seen the suffering of the French people and had chosen her, specifically her, to be the instrument of their salvation. The weight of this calling was crushing. Joan later testified that she wept when the voices first told her what she had to do, because she was only a poor girl who knew nothing of riding or warfare. But here's where Joan's story takes its first dark turn. The voices didn't just inspire her, they terrorized her. She claimed that if she didn't obey their commands, she would be damned. This wasn't a career opportunity, it was conscription by the Almighty. Joan was essentially being drafted by God himself, with the eternal fires of hell as the alternative to military service. As Joan grew older, the voices became more insistent. They began appearing to her multiple times a day, always accompanied by blinding light and sometimes by overwhelming fragrances. They knew things that Joan couldn't possibly know. They told her about military defeats before news reached her village. They predicted political developments with uncanny accuracy. Whether you believed these were genuine divine revelations or the hallucinations of a psychologically disturbed teenager, one thing is certain: they gave Joan access to intelligence that would make modern spy networks jealous. The voices also began to change Joan herself. She stopped wearing women's clothing, adopting male dress instead. She cut her hair short. She began speaking with an authority that was completely at odds with her humble origins and gender. Her family noticed that she had become distant, spending hours alone in prayer or staring off into space as if listening to conversations no one else could hear. This transformation didn't go unnoticed in Domremy, in a small village where everyone knew everyone else's business. A teenage girl claiming to receive personal messages from archangels was bound to attract attention. Some villagers thought Joan was blessed. Others worried she was possessed. A few simply thought she'd gone mad from the stress of living through an endless war. Joan's father, Jock, had his own concerns about his daughter's increasingly erratic behavior. According to Joan's later testimony, he had prophetic dreams in which she ran off with soldiers. In one particularly vivid nightmare, he saw her as a camp follower, the medieval equivalent of a groupie, servicing the sexual needs of an army. The dream so disturbed Jacques that he told Joan's brothers that if he ever thought it might come true, They should drown her rather than let her bring such shame on the family. Medieval parenting at its finest. But Jacques' fears weren't entirely irrational. Camp followers were indeed a part of medieval military life, and for a young woman to seek out soldiers was often seen as tantamount to prostitution. The line between holy warrior and fallen woman was thinner than most people today realize. Joan would spend much of her short career defending not just her military decisions, but her sexual purity as well. As 1428 turned to 1429, the voices became more urgent. They told Joan that time was running out. The siege of Orleans, which had been grinding on for months, was approaching a critical phase. If the English took the city, the last major stronghold of French resistance would fall, and Charles VII's cause would be lost forever. The voices made it clear Joan had to act now, or France would be lost for generations. The problem was that Joan was still just a peasant girl from a backwater village. She had no connections, no money, no influence. The distance between Domremy and the Dauphin's court might as well have been the distance to the moon. In medieval society, social mobility was virtually non-existent. Peasants stayed peasants, nobles stayed nobles, and teenage farm girls definitely didn't walk up to princes and demand armies. But Joan had something that transcended social barriers: absolute, unshakable conviction. She believed, with every fiber of her being, that God had chosen her for this mission. This wasn't ambition or delusion, it was divine calling, and she was willing to risk everything, including her life, to fulfill it. The voices had given her a plan. She was to go to the nearby town of Vaucouleurs and present herself to Robert de Baudricourt, the local military commander. Baudricourt was a practical man, a soldier who had spent his career fighting the English. He was also one of the few remaining French commanders who still acknowledged Charles VII as the legitimate king. If anyone could get Joan to the Dauphin's court, it was him. There was just one small problem. Baudricourt was about as likely to take orders from a teenage peasant girl as he was to sprout wings and fly to Paris. Joan would need to convince a battle-hardened military commander that God had personally selected a 17-year-old virgin to save France. She would need to do this without any credentials, references, or proof beyond her own testimony. In January 1429, Joan set out for Vaucouleurs. She was accompanied by her uncle, Durand Laxart, who had agreed to help her partly out of family loyalty and partly because he'd witnessed some of her more accurate prophecies and was starting to think there might be something to her claims. They told her parents that Joan was going to help Laxart's pregnant wife, a common enough request that wouldn't raise suspicions. The journey to Vaucouleurs was Joan's first real taste of the dangers that awaited anyone who traveled in war-torn France. The roads were patrolled by routiers, bands of mercenaries and brigands who preyed on travelers. These weren't romantic highwaymen, they were desperate men made savage by years of warfare, who would kill for a pair of shoes or rape for entertainment. The countryside was dotted with burned villages and unburied corpses. This was the world Joan was volunteering to enter, armed with nothing but faith and the voices in her head. When Joan finally stood before Robert de Baudricourt, she delivered her message with the confidence of an ambassador presenting credentials from a foreign power. She told him that God had sent her to save France, that she needed to see the Dauphin immediately, and that time was running out. She spoke of military secrets she couldn't possibly know, and made predictions that would later prove accurate. Baudricourt's response was about what you'd expect from a hardened military commander faced with a teenage girl claiming divine authority. He told Laxart to take Joan home, give her a good beating, and marry her off to someone who could keep her under control. Medieval mental health care in action. But Joan didn't give up. She returned to Vaucouleurs again and again throughout the winter of 1429, each time more insistent, more desperate, more convinced that the fate of France hung in the balance. Her persistence began to wear down not just Baudricourt, but the entire town. Vaucouleurs was full of soldiers, refugees, and displaced nobles who had lost everything to the English. They were looking for hope, for any sign that their cause wasn't entirely hopeless. Joan provided that hope. She spoke with such conviction, such detailed knowledge of military affairs, such unwavering faith that people began to listen. She accurately predicted a major French defeat at the Battle of the Herrings before news of it reached Vaucouleurs. She knew details about the siege of Orleans that hadn't been reported in the region. Most importantly, she radiated the kind of absolute certainty that people desperately wanted to believe in. Slowly, Joan began to gather supporters. A young nobleman named John de Metz was so impressed by her conviction that he pledged to accompany her to the Dauphin's court. Another knight, Bertrand de Poligny, also joined her cause. These weren't gullible peasants. They were experienced soldiers who had seen enough warfare to recognize both genuine inspiration and dangerous delusion. The fact that they chose to follow Joan says something profound about either her charisma or their desperation. By February 1429, the pressure on Baudricourt had become intense. The siege of Orleans was reaching a critical point, and his own position was becoming untenable. English and Burgundian forces were closing in on his territory, and he needed all the help he could get. More importantly, he was starting to wonder if maybe, just maybe, this strange peasant girl really had been sent by God. The final straw came when Joan made her most audacious prediction yet. She told Baudricourt that on a specific day, the French forces would suffer a terrible defeat near Orleans, and that this defeat would prove that her mission was urgent. When news of the Battle of the Herrings arrived exactly as Joan had predicted, Baudricourt finally agreed to send her to the Dauphin's court, but he wasn't taking any chances. Joan would travel in disguise, dressed as a man, accompanied by a small escort of trusted soldiers. The journey would take them through enemy territory, where discovery would mean death or worse. Joan would need to be convincing enough to fool English patrols, brave enough to face constant danger, and charismatic enough to maintain the loyalty of her escorts through weeks of hardship. On February 23, 1429, Joan of Arc set out from Vaucouleurs on the journey that would either make her the savior of France or get her killed as a delusional heretic. She was 17 years old, illiterate, and had never been more than a few miles from her home village. She was about to enter a world of courtly intrigue, military politics, and deadly warfare that would test every aspect of her character. The voices had promised her that this was just the beginning. They had told her that she would lift the siege of Orleans, see Charles crowned king, and drive the English from France. What they hadn't told her was that success would ultimately prove more dangerous than failure, and that the men who would hail her as a saint would eventually burn her as a witch. The journey from Vaucouleurs to Chinon, where the Dauphin held court, was like traveling through the circles of hell. Joan and her small escort had to cross 300 miles of territory controlled by hostile forces, dodging English patrols, Burgundian mercenaries, and the bands of brigands who treated war-torn France as their personal hunting ground. They traveled mostly at night, sleeping in forests and abandoned buildings, eating whatever they could find or steal. Joan had cut her hair short and bound her breasts to complete her masculine disguise. This wasn't just about avoiding detection. In medieval France, a woman traveling with soldiers was automatically assumed to be a prostitute. Joan's virginity wasn't just a personal matter, it was central to her entire mission. Her voices had made it clear that her purity was essential to her divine calling, and losing it would mean losing everything. The physical hardships of the journey were nothing compared to the psychological pressure Joan faced. Her escorts were seasoned soldiers who had risked their lives and reputations on the word of a peasant girl who claimed to talk to angels. Every day they didn't encounter a French patrol. Every night they spent huddled in some frozen ruin. The skepticism grew. If Joan was wrong about her divine mission, they were all dead men. But Joan never wavered. Even when they were nearly captured by an English patrol near Auxerre, even when they had to ford ice-cold rivers in the dead of winter, She maintained that God would protect them because their mission was holy. Her absolute certainty began to seem either divinely inspired or completely insane. And after 2 weeks on the road, the distinction was becoming academic. They reached Chinon on March 6, 1429, half-frozen, exhausted, and probably wondering if they'd made the worst decision of their lives. Chinon was less a royal court than a refugee camp for the French nobility. The castle was filled with dispossessed lords, bankrupt knights, and desperate courtiers who had fled the English advance. The air reeked of unwashed bodies, desperation, and the kind of political scheming that happens when a government is one military defeat away from complete collapse. Charles VII, the uncrowned Dauphin, was 26 years old and looked like a man who had been kicked repeatedly by fate. He was physically unprepossessing, with a weak chin, bulging eyes, and the general appearance of someone who would lose a fight with his own shadow. More importantly, he was psychologically shattered by years of military defeats, political betrayals, and the constant questioning of his legitimacy. You see, Charles had a little problem with his parentage. His mother, Isabeau of Bavaria, had been rather friendly with various men during her marriage to the mad King Charles. There were persistent rumors that the Dauphin wasn't actually royal blood at all, but the bastard son of one of his mother's numerous lovers. In a world where divine right was the only basis for political authority, these questions of legitimacy weren't just embarrassing, they were potentially fatal. Charles was also broke, which, in medieval terms, meant he was about as effective as a chocolate teapot. You can't fight wars without money, and the French treasury was so empty that the royal army was often months behind on pay. Soldiers were deserting in droves, not because they lacked courage, but because their families were starving while they fought for a king who couldn't afford to feed them. Into this nest of despair and dysfunction came Joan of Arc, 17 years old, dressed as a man, claiming divine authority to save France. The courtiers who first encountered her probably thought she was either a very elaborate joke or a symptom of the collective madness that seemed to be infecting everyone connected to the French cause. Joan's first challenge was simply getting an audience with Charles. The Dauphin's advisors weren't about to let some random peasant girl waste their desperate king's time, especially one who was spouting what sounded like religious delusions. They subjected Joan to preliminary questioning that was part theological examination and part psychological evaluation. Joan handled these interrogations with the skill of a trained diplomat. She refused to reveal the specific content of her divine messages, claiming they were for the Dauphin's ears only. She demonstrated knowledge of court politics and military affairs that a peasant girl shouldn't have possessed. Most importantly, she radiated the kind of absolute confidence that was completely at odds with the defeatist atmosphere pervading Chinon. Word of the strange peasant girl spread through the court like wildfire. Some courtiers dismissed her as a lunatic or a fraud. Others wondered if she might be an English spy, sent to infiltrate the court and assassinate the Dauphin. But a few began to whisper that maybe, just maybe, God really had sent them a miracle. The debate over Joan raged for days. Charles's advisors were divided between those who saw her as a dangerous distraction and those who thought she might be their last hope. Meanwhile, Joan waited, maintained her story, and apparently spent her time in prayer and preparation for the meeting that would determine the fate of France. Finally, Charles agreed to see her, but he arranged a test that was pure medieval theatre. When Joan was brought into the great hall at Chinon, Charles was not sitting on the throne. Instead, he had disguised himself as an ordinary courtier and placed another man on the royal seat. The idea was to see if Joan's divine voices could identify the true Dauphin among the crowd of nobles. According to multiple eyewitness accounts, Joan walked directly through the crowd of courtiers and knelt before Charles, despite never having seen him before. She addressed him as gentle Dauphin and told him that God had sent her to place the crown of France on his head. The court was stunned, but Charles remained skeptical. After all, Picking out the man with the weakest chin in a room full of French nobles wasn't exactly miraculous. What happened next was either the most important conversation in medieval history or an elaborate fraud that changed the course of Europe. Joan asked to speak with Charles privately, and for about an hour they were alone together. No one knows exactly what Joan told the Dauphin, but when they emerged, Charles was a changed man. Contemporary sources suggest that Joan revealed to Charles a secret prayer he had made months earlier, one that no other living person could have known about. She apparently told him things about his private doubts, his fears about his legitimacy, and his desperate prayers for divine guidance that convinced him she really was in contact with supernatural forces. Whether this was genuine prophecy, brilliant intelligence gathering, or psychological manipulation remains one of history's great mysteries. What we do know is that Charles decided to gamble everything on this peasant girl. He ordered that Joan be tested by the theologians at the University of Poitiers, the medieval equivalent of having your claims peer-reviewed by the most learned scholars in the kingdom. If they confirmed that Joan's visions were genuine and not demonic, Charles would give her what she asked for, an army to lift the siege of Orleans. The examination at Poitiers was brutal. For 3 weeks, Joan was grilled by some of the most learned theologians in Europe. They questioned her about the nature of her visions, the content of her revelations, and the theological implications of her claims. They were looking for any sign that she was either lying or possessed by demons, rather than inspired by God. Joan handled the interrogation with remarkable skill. She answered complex theological questions with the wisdom of a trained scholar. Despite being unable to read or write, she demonstrated detailed knowledge of scripture and church doctrine that astounded her examiners. Most importantly, she maintained her composure under intense pressure, never contradicting herself or backing down from her central claims. The theologians were particularly concerned about Joan's masculine dress and behavior. In medieval Christianity, women who dressed as men were violating God's natural order and could be accused of heresy. Joan's response was characteristically direct. God had commanded her to dress as a man for her mission, and she would continue to do so until that mission was complete. After 3 weeks of examination, the theologians reached their conclusion. Joan's visions appeared to be genuine divine revelations, not demonic deceptions. They couldn't find any doctrinal errors in her testimony or any evidence that she was lying. Most importantly, they noted that her mission, to drive foreign invaders from France and restore the rightful king, was consistent with God's will as revealed in Scripture. With the Church's blessing secured, Charles made the most desperate gamble of his reign. He gave Joan a suit of white armor, specially crafted for her small frame. He assigned her a household of knights and servants. Most incredibly, he gave her military authority over the relief expedition to Orleans. A 17-year-old peasant girl who had never seen a battle was now technically in command of professional soldiers with decades of combat experience. Joan's first act as a military commander was to demand that the army be purged of prostitutes, gamblers, and blasphemers. She ordered daily attendance at Mass and banned the soldiers from looting churches or harming civilians. These weren't popular reforms among men who had been fighting a brutal war for decades, but Joan enforced them with the authority of someone who genuinely believed God was watching every decision. She also sent a letter to the English commanders besieging Orleans. The document was a masterpiece of medieval psychological warfare, mixing diplomatic formality with divine threats that read like something from the Book of Revelation. Joan demanded that the English abandon their siege and return to England or face the wrath of God as delivered by his chosen maiden. The English response was to threaten to burn her as a witch if they captured her. As Joan prepared to march to Orleans, the entire character of the French cause began to change. Word spread throughout the kingdom that God had sent a maiden to save France. Peasants who had been hiding in forests began to emerge. Soldiers who had deserted returned to the colors. Nobles who had been sitting on the fence decided to declare for Charles VII. Joan hadn't won a single battle yet, but she had already achieved something that years of military campaigns had failed to accomplish. She had given the French hope, but hope, as Joan would soon discover, was a dangerous commodity in medieval warfare. It made soldiers brave, but it also made them reckless. It inspired loyalty, but it also created impossible expectations. Most dangerously, it made Joan herself a target not just of English arrows, but of the political machinations of the very people she was trying to save. The road to Orleans was about to become the stage for one of the most extraordinary military campaigns in history. Joan would either prove that she really was God's chosen instrument, or she would die trying. Either way, the teenage peasant girl who had arrived at Chinon as an unknown was about to become the most famous woman in Europe. Orleans in April 1429 was a city living on borrowed time, and everyone knew it. For 6 months, English forces had been slowly tightening their grip around the strategic city like a python crushing its prey. The siege wasn't just military, it was existential. If Orleans fell, the English would control the entire Loire Valley, effectively cutting what remained of Charles VII's kingdom in half. The city's fate would determine whether France survived as an independent nation or became another English possession. The English siege works were a marvel of medieval military engineering and a monument to systematic brutality. They had constructed a ring of fortified positions called bastilles around the city, each one a miniature fortress bristling with cannons, crossbows, and English longbowmen whose arrows could punch through armor at 200 yards. The most formidable of these was Les Tourelles, a massive fortified bridge that controlled access to the city from the south. Inside Orleans, the situation was becoming desperate. The city's population had swollen with refugees from the surrounding countryside, putting enormous strain on food supplies. Rats and dogs had become delicacies. Children were dying of starvation in the streets. The city's defenders, led by the Count of Dunois, were brave but outnumbered, and they knew that every day brought them closer to either surrender or massacre. The psychological warfare was perhaps even more devastating than the physical siege. The English had adopted a policy of deliberate terror, publicly executing any French prisoners they captured. They would burn villages within sight of Orleans walls, sending the message that this was what awaited anyone who resisted English rule. The defenders could see the smoke from these atrocities rising on the horizon like funeral pyres for French independence. Into this nightmare came Joan of Arc on April 29th, 1429, leading a relief force that was more desperate gamble than military expedition. The army that followed her was a mixture of battle-hardened veterans and raw recruits, united only by their faith in the peasant girl who claimed God was on their side. Joan herself cut a striking figure in her white armor, carrying a banner that depicted Christ in judgment and bore the words, "Jesus Mary." Joan's first sight of Orleans must have been sobering even for someone convinced of divine protection. The city was surrounded by a maze of English fortifications that had been strengthened over months of siege warfare. Professional military minds looked at those defenses and saw an impregnable fortress. Joan saw obstacles that God would help her overcome. Her first challenge wasn't the English, it was her own side. The French commanders, led by Dunois, had planned a careful, methodical approach to breaking the siege. They wanted to establish supply lines, conduct reconnaissance, and wait for reinforcements. Joan had a different plan: attack immediately, trust in God, and let divine will sort out the details. The tension between Joan's divinely inspired urgency and the commander's military pragmatism came to a head at their first war council. Dunois, a legitimate military genius who had been successfully defending impossible positions for years, tried to explain to Joan why her plan to assault the English fortifications directly would be suicidal. Joan's response was characteristically direct. God had not sent her to Orleans to conduct a siege, but to lift one. What happened next depends on whose account you believe, but all sources agree on one thing. Joan's absolute certainty began to infect everyone around her. Soldiers who had been preparing for a long, grinding campaign suddenly found themselves sharpening their weapons for immediate battle. The mood in the French camp shifted from grim determination to something approaching religious ecstasy. Joan's first military action was typically audacious. On May 4th, she led an assault on the Bastille of St. Loup, one of the smaller English fortifications. The attack succeeded, but not without cost. Joan saw men die for the first time, watching French soldiers cut down by English arrows and hearing their screams as they bled out in the mud. She wept over the bodies of both French and English dead, displaying a compassion that was remarkable in an age when warfare was often seen as divine judgment. But Joan's tears didn't prevent her from pressing the attack. Over the next 3 days, she led assault after assault against the English positions, each one more desperate than the last. The fighting was vicious even by medieval standards. Men fought hand to hand with swords, axes, and improvised weapons. The wounded crawled away to die in ditches. The air was thick with smoke, blood, and the screams of horses. Joan seemed to be everywhere at once during these battles, rallying troops, directing artillery, and exposing herself to enemy fire with a recklessness that either demonstrated divine protection or suicidal courage. She was wounded by a crossbow bolt at one point, but refused to leave the field, claiming that her voices had told her she would be wounded but not killed. The climax came on May 7th with the assault on Les Tourelles, the massive fortified bridge that was the key to the English siege. This wasn't just a military objective, it was a psychological one. Les Tourelles had been considered impregnable, and taking it would prove that the English weren't invincible. It would also open the southern approach to Orleans, allowing supplies and reinforcements to reach the city. The assault on Les Tourelles was a masterpiece of medieval siege warfare and a glimpse into hell. Joan led from the front, carrying her banner and shouting encouragement to the French troops as they scaled ladders under a hail of arrows, crossbow bolts, and stones. The English defenders fought with the desperation of men who knew that capture meant death, while the French attackers were driven by a mixture of desperation, religious fervor, and absolute faith in their divinely inspired leader. Joan was wounded again during the assault, struck by an arrow that penetrated between the plates of her armor. The wound was serious enough that she was carried from the field, and for a moment it seemed like the attack might falter. The English defenders, seeing Joan fall, began to cheer and redouble their resistance. But Joan wasn't finished. Despite her wound, despite the pain, despite the very real possibility that she was bleeding to death, she returned to the battle. She grabbed her banner and led one final charge against the English position. What happened next was either miraculous or the result of perfect timing and exceptional courage, depending on your perspective. The French assault overwhelmed the English defences. Les Tourelles fell, and with it, the entire English siege collapsed like a house of cards. English commanders who had been confident of victory just hours before found themselves in full retreat, abandoning months of siege works and losing hundreds of men in the process. The lifting of the siege of Orleans was Joan's first miracle, and it electrified Europe. A peasant girl had accomplished in 4 days what the greatest French commanders had been unable to do in 6 months. English forces that had seemed invincible were fleeing in disorder. The tide of the 100 Years' War had turned on the courage and faith of a 17-year-old who heard voices. But Joan's success at Orleans was also the beginning of her tragedy. The victory made her famous throughout Europe, which meant she was now a target for every English assassin, Burgundian spy, and French rival who wanted to eliminate the threat she represented. More dangerously, it created expectations that no human being could fulfill. Joan had become the living embodiment of French hopes, which meant that any failure, any sign of weakness, any hint that she might be merely human, would be seen as a betrayal of God himself. The political implications of Joan's victory were immediate and enormous. Charles VII, who had been a refugee king with a dubious claim to the throne, was suddenly the rightful monarch chosen by God and defended by his personal saint. English claims to French territory, which had been backed by decades of military success, were now opposed by divine will as demonstrated on the battlefield. European courts from Rome to London were suddenly forced to reassess their positions. Was Joan really a saint, as the French claimed, or was she a witch using demonic powers to achieve impossible victories, as the English insisted? The theological and political implications of this question would ultimately cost Joan her life, but for now, she was basking in the glory of a victory that had changed the course of history. Joan's own response to her triumph was characteristically complex. She was thrilled by the victory and convinced that it proved God's favor for her mission, but she was also troubled by the carnage she had witnessed. Medieval warfare was brutal beyond modern comprehension, and Joan had seen enough blood and death to haunt anyone with a conscience. Her voices had promised her victory, but they hadn't warned her about the cost in human suffering that victory would require. Most importantly, Joan knew that Orleans was just the beginning. Her voices had given her 3 tasks: lift the siege of Orleans, see Charles crowned king in Reims, and drive the English from France. She had accomplished the first, but the second and third would prove even more challenging. The road to Reims lay through English-held territory, and every mile would be contested by enemies who now knew exactly how dangerous Joan of Arc could be. The aftermath of Orleans transformed Joan from a curiosity into a phenomenon. News of the impossible victory spread across Europe with the speed of wildfire, carrying with it a message that terrified English commanders and inspired French peasants. God had chosen sides in the 100 Years' War, and he was French. But Joan's greatest victory was also her greatest trap. Success had made her indispensable to Charles VII's cause, which meant she was no longer free to follow her voices wherever they led. She was now a political asset, a living symbol of divine favor that had to be managed, protected, and deployed strategically. The peasant girl who had convinced a king to give her an army was discovering that fame was its own kind of prison. Charles's court, which had welcomed Joan as a savior after Orleans, now began to see her as a problem to be solved. Her divine mission called for immediate action, a lightning campaign to clear the Loire Valley, followed by a march on Reims for Charles's coronation. But the king's advisors favored a more cautious approach. They wanted to consolidate their gains, negotiate with Burgundy, and avoid the risks that came with Joan's all-or-nothing strategy. The tension between Joan's divine urgency and political pragmatism came to a head in the planning for the Loire campaign. Joan wanted to strike immediately while English morale was shattered and French enthusiasm was at its peak. Charles's generals preferred to wait for reinforcements, gather intelligence, and plan each move carefully. The debate raged for days, with Joan growing increasingly frustrated by what she saw as faithless delay. Joan's position was complicated by the fact that she was still, technically, a 17-year-old peasant girl with no formal military training. Her authority came entirely from her claim to divine inspiration, which meant that any military failure could be interpreted as proof that God had abandoned her cause. She was gambling not just with her life, but with her entire spiritual credibility on every tactical decision. The compromise that emerged was typical of medieval politics. Joan would get her campaign, but it would be conducted under the supervision of professional commanders who could rein in her more audacious impulses. It was a solution that satisfied no one and pleased everyone, the kind of political arrangement that medieval courts specialized in creating. The Loire campaign that followed was a masterclass in psychological warfare disguised as military strategy. Joan's very presence on the battlefield seemed to demoralize English forces and inspire French troops to impossible acts of courage. Town after town surrendered at the mere rumor of her approach. English commanders who had been confident just weeks before now found themselves retreating from positions they had held for years. Jargeau fell on June 12th, after a siege that lasted barely 2 days. The English commander, the Earl of Suffolk, was captured by Joan personally, a humiliation that sent shockwaves through the English command structure. Mont-sur-Loire and Beaugency followed in rapid succession, their English garrisons melting away rather than face the Maid of Orleans in battle. But the campaign's climax came at Patay on June 18th, where Joan's forces encountered the main English field army under Sir John Fastolfe. What followed was less a battle than a massacre. The French attacked with such ferocity, inspired by Joan's presence and convinced of divine protection, that the English line collapsed within minutes. Over 2,000 English soldiers were killed or captured, while French losses numbered in the dozens. Patay was significant not just as a military victory, but as a psychological breaking point. The English army that had dominated European battlefields for decades, the same force that had crushed French chivalry at Crécy and Agincourt, had been routed by an opponent led by a teenage girl. The myth of English military invincibility, built up over generations of conquest, lay shattered in a French field. Joan's response to this stunning success was characteristically complex. She wept over the English dead, ordering that they be given proper burial despite being enemies. She refused to allow the French troops to massacre prisoners, insisting that Christian mercy must temper military victory. Her compassion was genuine, but it also revealed the psychological toll that constant warfare was taking on someone who had been raised to believe in the sanctity of human life. The political implications of the Loire victories were immediate and far-reaching. Charles VII, who had been a weak pretender just months before, was now clearly God's chosen king, as demonstrated by military success. English claims to French territory looked increasingly hollow in the face of repeated defeats. Most importantly, the road to Reims was now open, and with it the possibility of Charles's coronation in the traditional cathedral of French kings. But Joan's success also created new dangers. Her growing fame made her a target for assassination attempts by English agents and Burgundian spies. More subtly, her military victories were attracting the attention of French nobles, who saw her as either a threat to their own ambitions or an opportunity to advance their careers. The medieval court was a snake pit of competing interests, and Joan's divine mission was about to collide with very human politics. The march to Reims began on June 29, 1429, with Joan riding at the head of an army that had grown from a desperate relief force into something resembling a crusade. Towns along the route surrendered without resistance, their populations turning out to cheer the maid who had been sent by God to save France. It was a triumphal procession that would have impressed a Roman emperor, except that Joan remained focused on her ultimate objective, placing the crown of France on Charles VII's head in the cathedral where French kings had been crowned for centuries. But even as Joan marched toward her greatest triumph, the seeds of her destruction were already being planted. English commanders, stung by repeated defeats, were beginning to develop a new strategy. Rather than trying to defeat Joan militarily, they would destroy her theologically. They began spreading rumors that she was a witch, that her victories came from demonic rather than divine sources, and that her execution would free France from supernatural corruption. These weren't just propaganda efforts. They were the beginning of a systematic campaign to reframe Joan's story from divine mission to demonic delusion. English theologians began preparing detailed arguments about why Joan's victories proved she was in league with Satan. They cited biblical precedent, theological authority, and canon law to build a case that would eventually burn her at the stake. Joan herself remained focused on her immediate mission, apparently unaware that her enemies were shifting from military to theological warfare. Her voices continued to guide her, but they were becoming less specific in their instructions and more ominous in their warnings. They began to tell her that she would be captured before midsummer, though they assured her that this was part of God's plan for her ultimate victory. The coronation at Reims on July 17, 1429, was the climax of Joan's mission and the beginning of her tragedy. Charles VII was crowned King of France in a ceremony that had been impossible just months before, with Joan standing beside him, holding her banner. The symbolism was overwhelming. The peasant girl had fulfilled her divine mission, proving that God had indeed chosen Charles as the rightful king of France. But the ceremony also marked a fundamental change in Joan's position. She had accomplished 2 of the 3 tasks her voices had given her, lifting the siege of Orleans and seeing Charles crowned king. The 3rd task, driving the English from France entirely, was far more complex and would require years of sustained military campaigning. Joan was no longer an emergency measure. She was now a long-term strategic asset that needed to be managed carefully. Charles's attitude toward Joan began to change almost immediately after his coronation. The desperate king who had gambled everything on a peasant girl's visions was now a legitimate monarch who needed to consider political realities. Joan's calls for immediate campaigns against English strongholds were now balanced against diplomatic opportunities, financial constraints, and the complex web of European politics. Joan found herself increasingly isolated within the royal court. Nobles who had praised her divine mission now whispered about her peasant origins and masculine behavior. Churchmen who had confirmed her visions now questioned whether her continued military activity was appropriate for a woman. Most dangerously, politicians began to see her as an obstacle to potential peace negotiations with England and Burgundy. The voices that had guided Joan through her greatest triumphs began to change in character. They became less specific about military strategy and more focused on warnings about betrayal and capture. Saint Michael told her that she must accept whatever suffering God sent her, that her mission required sacrifice as well as victory. The voices that had once promised triumph now spoke of martyrdom. Joan's response to these changes was to double down on military action. She believed that complete victory over the English was the only way to secure the gains she had made for France. Compromise and negotiation seemed like betrayals of the divine mission that had cost so much blood to advance. She pushed for campaigns against Paris, against English strongholds in Normandy, against any target that would bring her closer to driving the invaders from French soil. But Joan was no longer the desperate king's last hope. She was now one option among many in Charles VII's strategic calculations. The political dynamics that had made her indispensable after Orleans were shifting, and she was beginning to discover that divine missions were no match for royal politics when the two came into conflict. The tragedy was that Joan's greatest strength, her absolute faith in her divine calling, was becoming her greatest weakness in a world where compromise and flexibility were essential for survival. She could not adapt to changing circumstances because she believed those circumstances were irrelevant to God's will. She could not accept political constraints because she answered to a higher authority than any earthly king. As 1429 turned toward its end, Joan of Arc found herself in an impossible position. She had achieved everything she had been sent to do, but her mission felt incomplete. She had saved France, but France was not yet fully saved. She had proven God's favor for the French cause, but that proof would mean nothing if the English returned stronger than before. Most dangerously, she had become a victim of her own success, trapped by expectations she had created and could no longer control. The voices were still speaking to her, but now they spoke of capture, of trials, of suffering that would test her faith to its limits. Joan accepted these warnings with the same absolute faith she had shown in accepting her original mission, not understanding that she was about to enter a phase of her story where faith alone would not be enough to survive. The winter of 1429 to 1430 marked a turning point in Joan's story, though not the kind her voices had promised. Instead of driving the English from France entirely, she found herself caught in a web of political machinations that would have challenged a seasoned diplomat, let alone a peasant girl who believed divine will could overcome human treachery. Charles VII, now securely crowned and growing in confidence, began to pursue a strategy that horrified Joan: negotiation with the enemy. The king's advisors argued that military victories should be leveraged into diplomatic gains, that the time had come to secure, through treaties, what had been won by the sword. They spoke of truces with Burgundy, of territorial compromises with England, of the kind of pragmatic solutions that had kept medieval politics functioning for centuries. Joan's response to these diplomatic initiatives was predictably direct. God had not sent her to France to make deals with invaders, but to drive them out entirely. Her voices had been clear about the ultimate objective, and anything less than complete victory was a betrayal of her divine mission. The idea of leaving English forces in control of any French territory was not just strategically unacceptable, it was spiritually impossible. This fundamental disagreement between Joan's divine absolutism and Charles's political pragmatism created a crisis that neither side fully understood. The king needed Joan's military reputation and the popular support she commanded, but he also needed the flexibility to respond to changing political circumstances. Joan needed the king's continued backing for her mission, but she could not compromise on objectives that she believed came directly from God. The tension came to a head over the question of Compiègne, a strategically important city that controlled key river crossings north of Paris. Charles was willing to trade Compiègne to Burgundy as part of a broader peace settlement, viewing it as an acceptable loss in exchange for Burgundian neutrality. Joan saw the proposed surrender of any French city to foreign control as a betrayal of everything she had fought to achieve. In March 1430, Joan made a decision that would ultimately cost her everything. She left the royal court without permission and set out for Compiègne with a small force of volunteers. It was an act of defiance that broke her relationship with Charles VII and put her outside the protection of royal authority. Joan was now operating as an independent military commander, answerable only to the voices that had started her on this path. The decision to go to Compiègne was militarily defensible but politically catastrophic. Joan was responding to appeals from the city's defenders, who faced overwhelming Burgundian forces backed by English support. From a strategic perspective, Compiègne's fall would open the approaches to Paris and undo much of what Joan had accomplished in the Loire Valley. But by acting without royal authorization, Joan had transformed herself from a national hero into a rogue commander, whose capture would embarrass rather than devastate Charles VII. Joan's small force reached Compiègne in early May and immediately began conducting aggressive raids against Burgundian positions around the city. These attacks were tactically successful but strategically pointless, inflicting casualties on the besiegers without fundamentally altering the balance of forces. Joan was fighting with the same courage and determination that had won at Orleans, but she was no longer supported by the resources of a kingdom or protected by the authority of a king. The Burgundian response was swift and overwhelming. Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, recognized that capturing Joan would be a propaganda victory worth more than any military conquest. He assembled a massive force under John of Luxembourg, one of his most capable commanders, with orders to take the Maid of Orleans alive, if possible. The political implications of her capture were too valuable to waste on a quick execution. On May 23, 1430, Joan led what would be her final charge. During a skirmish outside Compiègne's walls, her small force was overwhelmed by superior numbers and cut off from the city's gates. In the chaos of retreat, Joan found herself isolated on the battlefield, surrounded by Burgundian soldiers who recognized the fortune that had literally fallen into their hands. The capture of Joan of Arc was both inevitable and shocking. Inevitable because she had been operating without sufficient support against overwhelming odds. Shocking because she had seemed almost supernaturally protected throughout her previous campaigns. The peasant girl who had walked unscathed through the carnage of Orleans and Patay was finally brought down, not by English arrows or Burgundian lances, but by the simple mathematics of medieval warfare. When you're outnumbered and outmaneuvered, even divine protection has its limits. Joan's first captors were Burgundian soldiers under the command of John of Luxembourg, who immediately recognized the political goldmine they had stumbled upon. Joan was the most famous woman in Europe, the living symbol of French resistance to English rule, and the alleged saint whose capture would prove that God had abandoned the French cause. More practically, she was worth a king's ransom to anyone willing to pay for her. The news of Joan's capture spread across Europe with shocking speed, carried by merchants, pilgrims, and professional messengers who understood the magnitude of what had happened. In Paris, English officials celebrated as if they had won a major battle. In the French territories, still loyal to Charles VII, the reaction was stunned disbelief, followed by desperate attempts to organize a rescue mission. Charles VII's response to Joan's capture revealed the political calculation that now governed his relationship with the woman who had made his crown possible. The king made no serious effort to ransom Joan or exchange prisoners for her release, despite having the resources to do so. From Charles's perspective, Joan had become a political liability whose capture might actually simplify his diplomatic position. This abandonment by the king she had served so faithfully was perhaps the cruelest aspect of Joan's capture. She had expected betrayal from enemies, but she had trusted in the loyalty of the French court. Her voices had warned her of capture, but they had not prepared her for the possibility that her own side would see her imprisonment as politically convenient. Meanwhile, the English government, under Henry VI, was conducting its own calculations about what to do with their famous prisoner. Simply executing Joan would make her a martyr and potentially inspire more French resistance. But keeping her alive raised the dangerous possibility that she might escape or be rescued. The solution they arrived at was characteristically medieval in its complexity. They would put Joan on trial for heresy and witchcraft, proving that her victories had come from demonic rather than divine sources. The decision to try Joan as a heretic rather than execute her as a prisoner of war was brilliant propaganda and terrible theology. It allowed the English to argue that their defeats had been caused by supernatural intervention rather than military incompetence. It also opened the possibility of discrediting not just Joan personally, but the entire French cause she represented. If Joan was a witch, then Charles VII's coronation was invalid, and English claims to France remained legitimate. Joan spent the months following her capture being moved from castle to castle, while her captors negotiated the terms of her sale to the English. She was treated relatively well by medieval standards, held in comfortable quarters, and provided with adequate food and clothing. But she was also kept under constant guard and denied access to friendly clergy or legal counsel. Her isolation was as much psychological as physical, designed to weaken her resolve before the trial that would determine her fate. During this period of captivity, Joan's voices underwent another transformation. They began to speak less of military victory and more of spiritual triumph through suffering. Saint Michael told her that she must accept whatever trials God sent her, that her mission now required endurance rather than conquest. The voices that had once promised her glory now spoke of martyrdom as the ultimate form of victory. Joan's response to these new instructions was characteristically absolute. If God required her to suffer for France, then she would suffer. If her mission now called for martyrdom rather than military success, then she would embrace martyrdom with the same faith she had shown in embracing warfare. Her captors might control her body, but they could not touch the spiritual conviction that had driven her from the beginning. The negotiations for Joan's purchase by the English took months, partly because of the enormous sum involved, and partly because of the complex legal questions her status raised. Was she a prisoner of war, a common criminal, or a religious heretic? The answer would determine not just her treatment, but the legal framework for her trial and the potential consequences of her conviction. Finally, in November 1430, John of Luxembourg agreed to sell Joan to the English for the astronomical sum of 10,000 francs, equivalent to the ransom of a great noble or the cost of maintaining an army for months. The price reflected both Joan's fame and the political value of her capture. She was, quite literally, the most expensive prisoner in Europe. Joan's transfer to English custody marked the beginning of the final phase of her story. She was taken to Rouen, the English administrative capital in France, where preparations were already underway for a trial that would be part theological examination, part political show trial, and part public execution. The English had paid a fortune for Joan, not just to silence her, but to prove that everything she represented was a lie. But Joan's captors had made a fundamental miscalculation. They assumed that imprisonment, isolation, and the threat of death would break the spirit that had carried her from Domremy to Orleans to Reims. They believed that faced with the choice between recantation and execution, Joan would choose life over principle. They were about to discover that some forms of faith are stronger than the fear of death, and that martyrdom can be more powerful than any military victory. The trial of Joan of Arc, which began on February 21st, 1431, was simultaneously the most important legal proceeding of the medieval period and one of the greatest miscarriages of justice in human history. It was designed to be a theological examination of Joan's claims to divine inspiration, but it functioned as a political show trial whose outcome was predetermined by the very people conducting it. The English had chosen their location carefully. Rouen was the administrative capital of English-occupied France, a city where English authority was absolute and French sympathies were dangerous to express publicly. The trial would be conducted in the chapel of Rouen Castle, surrounded by English soldiers and presided over by judges who owed their positions to English patronage. Pierre Cauchon, the Bishop of Beauvais, was selected to preside over the proceedings. Cauchon was a French clergyman, but one whose loyalty to the English cause was absolute. He had been driven from his bishopric by Joan's military campaigns and had a personal as well as political interest in seeing her destroyed. More importantly, he was a skilled theologian and experienced inquisitor who understood how to manipulate canon law to achieve predetermined outcomes. The charges against Joan were numerous and complex, ranging from heresy and witchcraft to the wearing of men's clothing and claiming direct revelation from God. But the central accusation was that Joan's voices came not from heaven but from hell, that she was a tool of Satan rather than a servant of God. If this could be proven, it would not only justify her execution but discredit everything she had accomplished for France. Joan faced her accusers alone, without legal counsel, without friendly witnesses, and without access to the theological texts that might have helped her construct a defense. In the medieval legal system, this was not unusual for heresy trials, where the accused was expected to rely on divine assistance rather than human advocacy. But Joan's isolation was more complete than most, deliberately constructed to maximize her vulnerability. The trial proceedings revealed Joan at her most remarkable and most tragic, facing some of the most learned theologians in Europe, armed with nothing but her faith and her memories of divine encounters. She defended not just her own life, but the entire foundation of her mission. Her responses to the complex theological questions posed by her judges demonstrate both her remarkable intelligence and her absolute unwillingness to compromise on matters of spiritual truth. When asked about the nature of her voices, Joan described encounters so vivid and detailed that they convinced even some of her judges that she was either genuinely inspired or genuinely insane. She spoke of Saint Michael appearing in blazing light, of Saint Margaret and Saint Catherine, addressing her with such clarity that she could distinguish their individual voices. She described conversations about military strategy, political developments, and theological questions that lasted for hours. Cauchon and his fellow judges were looking for contradictions, heresies, or admissions that would prove Joan's voices were demonic. Instead, they found a consistency and theological sophistication that was difficult to explain in a peasant girl with no formal education. Joan's answers were often more theologically sound than the questions designed to trap her, revealing an understanding of divine revelation that impressed even her enemies. The judges made repeated attempts to trick Joan into incriminating statements, They asked whether she was in a state of grace, a question designed to trap her between the heresy of claiming certainty about her salvation and the spiritual despair of denying God's favor. Joan's response was masterful. "If I am not, may God put me there. If I am, may God keep me there." It was an answer that revealed both theological wisdom and unshakable faith. The trial dragged on for months, partly because the judges were struggling to find grounds for conviction, and partly because Joan's responses were creating sympathy, even among those predisposed to condemn her. Her courage, her faith, and her refusal to be intimidated by learned men trying to twist her words were impressing observers, who had expected to see a delusional peasant girl crumble under pressure. But Joan was fighting a battle she could not win. The trial was not really about determining her guilt or innocence. It was about providing legal cover for a political execution. The English needed Joan to be proven a heretic to justify her death and discredit her achievements. No amount of theological sophistication or spiritual courage could overcome the fundamental fact that her judges had already decided her fate. The psychological pressure of the trial was enormous. Joan was 19 years old, imprisoned in a foreign city, facing death at the hands of men who twisted every word she spoke. She was cut off from the voices that had guided her, isolated from friends and supporters, and confronted daily with evidence of her abandonment by the very people she had served. Lesser spirits would have broken under far less pressure. Joan's lowest moment came when she was shown the instruments of torture that would be used to extract a confession if she continued to maintain her innocence. Medieval torture was a science of pain, designed to inflict maximum agony while keeping the victim alive and conscious. The threat was not idle. Heretics who refused to confess were routinely tortured until they either recanted or died in the process. Faced with this ultimate threat, Joan did something that has puzzled historians for centuries. She briefly recanted her claims, agreeing to sign a document that admitted her voices were false and her mission was a delusion. The recantation was extracted under duress and immediately regretted, but it provided the legal pretext her judges needed to proceed with execution. Joan's recantation lasted only a few days. She quickly realized that admitting her voices were false would mean admitting that everything she had done for France was based on lies. It would mean that the soldiers who had died following her into battle had died for nothing. It would mean that God had never spoken to her, that her mission had been a delusion, and that her life had been meaningless. On May 28, 1431, Joan formally withdrew her recantation and reaffirmed her faith in her divine mission. She told her judges that she would rather die than live with the lie that God had never spoken to her. It was an act of courage that sealed her fate but preserved her integrity. Joan chose martyrdom over survival, truth over life, faith over fear. The final phase of the trial was purely ceremonial. Having obtained and then lost Joan's recantation, the judges declared her a relapsed heretic, a category that carried an automatic death sentence. There would be no further opportunities for confession, no possibility of commuting the sentence, no escape from the flames that awaited her. Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orleans, would burn as a witch. But even in condemning Joan, the judges revealed their own doubts about the justice of their proceedings. The sentence was read in Latin, a language Joan did not understand, and the theological justifications were so complex that even educated observers struggled to follow them. The entire process had the feel of learned men convincing themselves that they were doing God's work while executing someone they suspected might actually be a saint. Joan's response to her death sentence was characteristically direct. She told her judges that they were condemning an innocent woman and that God would hold them accountable for their actions. She asked for a cross to hold during her execution and requested that prayers be said for her soul. She faced the prospect of burning alive with the same calm courage she had shown in facing English armies. The trial of Joan of Arc was over, but its consequences were just beginning. The English had gotten their legal justification for executing the most famous woman in Europe, but they had also created a detailed record of Joan's faith, courage, and theological sophistication under pressure. The transcripts of her trial would become, ironically, the primary evidence for her eventual canonization as a saint. Joan had lost the legal battle, but she was about to win something far more important: immortality as a martyr whose death would inspire French resistance for generations. The judges who condemned her would be forgotten by history, while the peasant girl they burned would become one of the most famous figures in human history. Sometimes losing everything is the only way to win the thing that matters most. May 30th, 1431, dawned grey and drizzling in Rouen, as if the heavens themselves were weeping for what was about to unfold in the city's market square. By 8 in the morning, thousands of spectators had gathered to witness the execution of the most famous woman in Europe. English soldiers, French collaborators, curious townspeople, and travelling merchants jostled for the best views of the spectacle that would either vindicate English claims to divine favour or create the most powerful martyr in French history. The English authorities had spared no expense in staging Joan's execution as a public demonstration of their power and righteousness. A massive pyre had been constructed in the centre of the square, built high enough that the entire crowd could witness Joan's final moments. The symbolism was deliberate. The woman who had claimed divine authority would be consumed by the same fires that awaited heretics in hell. Joan was brought from her prison cell at 9 o'clock, dressed in a white shift that marked her as a penitent heretic. But there was nothing penitent about her demeanour as she walked through the hostile crowd. Witnesses described her as calm, composed, and focused on something beyond the immediate horror of her situation. She carried herself with the dignity of someone who believed she was about to join the saints in paradise, rather than suffer the agonies of public execution. The crowd's reaction to Joan's appearance was complex and revealing. Many had come expecting to see a broken woman, crushed by months of imprisonment and the certainty of a hideous death. Instead, they saw a 19-year-old girl who walked to her execution with the bearing of a queen going to her coronation. Some spectators began to murmur that perhaps there was something divine about this peasant girl after all. Before mounting the pyre, Joan was forced to listen to a final sermon delivered by Nicolas Midi, a theologian from the University of Paris who had participated in her trial. Midi's sermon was a masterpiece of medieval propaganda, explaining to the crowd why Joan's execution was necessary for the salvation of France and the glory of England. He portrayed her as a dangerous seductress who had led good Christians astray with demonic powers disguised as divine inspiration. Joan's response to this final humiliation was to interrupt Midi's sermon and address the crowd directly. Speaking in a voice that carried across the square despite the jeers and catcalls of English soldiers, she proclaimed her innocence and reaffirmed her faith in the divine origin of her mission. She forgave her enemies, prayed for the soul of King Charles VII, who had abandoned her, and asked God to protect France even if he would not protect her. As Joan was led to the stake, she made one final request that revealed both her humanity and her unshakable faith. She asked for a cross to hold during her execution, not the elaborate crucifix that might have been provided for a noble heretic, but a simple wooden cross made from 2 sticks. An English soldier, moved by either compassion or superstition, quickly fashioned such a cross and handed it to Joan as she climbed onto the pyre. The executioner, Guillaume le Boucher, was a professional who had burned dozens of heretics, witches, and criminals during his career. But he later confessed that Joan's execution haunted him for the rest of his life, as he lit the kindling at the base of the pyre. Joan looked directly at him and spoke words of forgiveness that no condemned heretic had ever addressed to him before. The flames caught quickly in the dry wood and straw that surrounded the base of the pyre. Medieval execution by burning was designed to maximize both suffering and spectacle, with the fire built to rise slowly so that the victim would be conscious for as long as possible But Joan's execution differed from the typical burning in ways that would fuel legends and theological debates for centuries. Witnesses reported that, as the flames rose around her, Joan began to pray aloud, calling on Jesus, Mary, and her saints to receive her soul. Her voice remained audible above the roar of the fire longer than should have been physically possible, leading some observers to claim they were witnessing a miracle. Others noted that Joan's face showed no signs of the terror or agony that usually marked victims of burning, but instead displayed an expression of peaceful anticipation. The most controversial aspect of Joan's execution was what happened to her body as the flames consumed it. Multiple witnesses, including English soldiers who had no reason to fabricate miracles, reported that her heart remained intact even after the rest of her body had been reduced to ash. This phenomenon was interpreted by believers as proof of Joan's sanctity and, by skeptics, as a natural oddity with no supernatural significance. But the most powerful testimony to Joan's impact came from her executioner himself. Guillaume Le Boucher, who had witnessed dozens of deaths by burning, claimed that as Joan died, he saw a white dove fly up from the flames and disappear into the sky. Whether this was literal truth, symbolic vision, or guilty conscience, Le Boucher's account spread throughout Europe and became one of the foundational legends of Joan's martyrdom. The English authorities, recognizing that Joan's death was creating exactly the kind of martyrdom they had hoped to avoid, took extraordinary measures to prevent her remains from becoming religious relics. They gathered her ashes and threw them into the Seine River, ensuring that there would be no tomb for pilgrims to visit, no physical remains for believers to venerate, no focal point for a cult of Saint Joan. But these precautions backfired spectacularly. By destroying Joan's remains so thoroughly, the English inadvertently created the impression that they feared her power even in death. The very completeness of their efforts to erase her physical presence suggested that they believed she posed a supernatural threat that could survive her execution. They had wanted to prove Joan was a powerless fraud, but their actions suggested they thought she was a powerful saint. The immediate political effects of Joan's execution were mixed. In England, her death was celebrated as a victory over French witchcraft and divine vindication of English claims to France. King Henry VI declared a day of thanksgiving for the elimination of the demon who had deceived the French people. English commanders hoped that Joan's death would break the spirit of French resistance and open the way for final conquest. In France, the reaction was more complex. Charles VII made no public statement about Joan's execution, apparently hoping that silence would minimize the political damage to his own reputation. Many French nobles, who had never been comfortable with a peasant girl claiming divine authority, privately breathed sighs of relief that the problem of Joan of Arc had been solved by English action rather than French betrayal. But among the common people of France, Joan's execution had exactly the opposite effect that the English had intended. Instead of proving that resistance was futile, her martyrdom demonstrated that the French cause was worth dying for. Instead of discrediting divine favor for France, her courage in the face of death suggested that God was testing French faith rather than abandoning French hopes. The transformation of Joan from military commander to religious martyr began almost immediately after her execution. Stories of her sanctity, her miracles, and her prophetic powers spread throughout Europe with remarkable speed. Pilgrims began visiting the site of her execution despite official prohibitions. Prayers were offered for her intercession despite ecclesiastical disapproval. The peasant girl who had been burned as a heretic was being venerated as a saint. Perhaps the most ironic consequence of Joan's execution was its effect on the very trial that had condemned her. The detailed transcripts of her interrogations, which had been compiled to justify her death, instead became evidence of her holiness. Her theological sophistication, her courage under pressure, and her unwavering faith in the face of death were all documented by the same judges who had condemned her as a heretic. Within months of Joan's execution, The political landscape of Europe began to shift in ways that vindicated her mission more powerfully than any military victory could have done. The English, who had expected her death to demoralize French resistance, instead found themselves facing a reinvigorated enemy inspired by martyrdom rather than cowed by intimidation. The Duke of Bedford, the English regent in France, reportedly said that he would rather have lost 10,000 soldiers than see Joan burned, because her execution had made her more dangerous dead than she had ever been alive. English commanders, who had celebrated her capture, now found themselves dealing with French forces fighting with religious fervor rather than merely patriotic determination. Charles VII, who had abandoned Joan to preserve his political flexibility, discovered that her martyrdom had given him a moral authority that military victories alone could never have provided. The king, who had been crowned by divine favor, as demonstrated by Joan's miraculous campaigns, was now the ruler whose saint had died for France. It was a transformation from political pragmatism to religious mission that would define the final phase of the 100 Years' War. But perhaps the most profound impact of Joan's execution was on the English position in France itself. The occupation had always depended on a combination of military force and political collaboration from French nobles who saw advantage in English rule. Joan's martyrdom began to transform this collaboration from pragmatic alliance into spiritual betrayal. French nobles who had supported English rule found themselves defending a regime that had burned a French saint. French clergy who had validated English claims to divine favor now had to explain why God had allowed his chosen maiden to be martyred by the very forces they supported. The theological and political contradictions created by Joan's execution began to undermine English authority from within. The rehabilitation of Joan of Arc began almost before the flames that consumed her had died down. It was driven not by official church pronouncements or royal proclamations, but by the grassroots veneration of ordinary people who recognized sanctity when they saw it, regardless of what learnt judges or political authorities might decree. Within a year of her execution, pilgrimages to Rouen had become so common that English authorities were forced to post guards around the execution site to prevent the collection of relics. Soil from the market square where Joan had died was being smuggled out in small pouches and carried throughout France as protection against English oppression. The very completeness of the English efforts to erase Joan's physical presence had made every trace of her martyrdom precious to those who believed in her sanctity. The popular canonization of Joan was accompanied by an explosion of reported miracles attributed to her intercession. French soldiers claimed that prayers to Joan had protected them in battle. Peasants reported that invoking her name had saved their crops from English raiders. Most significantly, French military commanders began to experience a string of victories against English forces that seemed to vindicate Joan's prophecy that God would drive the invaders from France. But the most important transformation triggered by Joan's martyrdom was the psychological shift in how the French people understood their struggle against English occupation. What had been a political conflict over territorial claims was becoming a religious war between the nation that God had chosen and the foreign invaders who had martyred his saint. Joan's death had transformed the 100 Years' War from a dynastic dispute into a holy war. Charles VII, initially cautious about associating himself too closely with a condemned heretic, gradually began to embrace Joan's legacy as the political benefits became clear. Her martyrdom had given his reign a divine legitimacy that no amount of military success could have provided. More practically, it had inspired French resistance throughout the kingdom and begun to erode English authority from within. In 1449, 18 years after Joan's execution, Charles VII ordered a formal investigation into the trial that had condemned her. This wasn't just historical curiosity, it was political necessity. The king needed to officially vindicate Joan's mission in order to legitimize the authority he had derived from it. If Joan was a heretic, then his coronation at Reims was invalid, and his entire reign was built on demonic deception. The rehabilitation trial that began in 1455 was as politically motivated as the original condemnation, but it was conducted with far greater attention to actual justice. The surviving participants in Joan's original trial were called to testify about the procedures that had been used to convict her. The transcripts of her interrogations were examined by theologians who were sympathetic rather than hostile to her claims. Most importantly, witnesses to Joan's life and military campaigns were allowed to testify about her character, her faith, and her achievements. The testimony gathered during the rehabilitation trial painted a picture of Joan that was radically different from the demonic seductress portrayed by her English judges. Witnesses described a young woman of exceptional piety, unwavering courage, and genuine compassion for both French and English victims of warfare. They testified to her theological sophistication, her military genius, and her unwavering commitment to her divine mission even in the face of death. Perhaps most damaging to the original trial was the testimony about the procedures used to convict Joan. Witnesses revealed that she had been denied legal counsel, that her judges had been selected for their hostility to her cause, and that the charges against her had been constructed to ensure conviction, regardless of the evidence. The rehabilitation trial documented a systematic perversion of justice that shocked even medieval sensibilities. On July 7, 1456, 25 years after Joan's execution, the rehabilitation trial reached its conclusion. The judges declared that Joan's original trial had been conducted illegally, that her conviction was invalid, and that she had died as an innocent martyr rather than a guilty heretic. The sentence that had condemned her was formally annulled, and her memory was officially rehabilitated. But the rehabilitation trial did more than simply clear Joan's name. It established the historical record that would shape her legacy for centuries. The detailed testimony about her life, her mission, and her death provided the documentary foundation for understanding Joan as both a historical figure and a religious inspiration. The very completeness of the English records of her trial, compiled to justify her execution, became the primary evidence for her eventual canonization. The political effects of Joan's rehabilitation were immediate and far-reaching. French resistance to English occupation, which had been inspired by her martyrdom, was now validated by official church proclamation of her innocence. English claims to divine favor for their conquest of France were undermined by the recognition that they had martyred a saint. Most importantly, Charles VII's authority was confirmed as legitimate by the vindication of the woman who had made his coronation possible. But the rehabilitation of Joan of Arc also had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate political situation in France. Her story became a template for understanding how divine will could operate through the most unlikely human instruments. A peasant girl had changed the course of European history by refusing to compromise on her faith, and her example would inspire religious and political reformers for generations. The transformation of Joan from condemned heretic to recognized saint was not completed until 1920, when Pope Benedict XV formally canonized her as Saint Joan of Arc. But her influence on European history had been growing for centuries, inspiring everything from French nationalism to feminist theology to theories about the relationship between divine revelation and political action. Joan's canonization was controversial even in the 20th century, partly because her story raised uncomfortable questions about the relationship between religious authority and political power. If Joan's voices were genuine divine revelations, what did that say about the church officials who had condemned her? If her mission was truly from God, how could the institutional church have been so wrong about recognizing it? These theological puzzles were complicated by the political dimensions of Joan's legacy. She had become a symbol of French nationalism, invoked by everyone from Napoleon to Charles de Gaulle to justify French resistance to foreign domination. Her story had been used to support everything from monarchism to republicanism to fascism, depending on which aspects of her life different political movements chose to emphasize. But perhaps the most enduring aspect of Joan's legacy is the way her story challenges conventional assumptions about how history is made. She demonstrated that the most unlikely people, armed with nothing but absolute faith and unshakable conviction, could change the world in ways that armies and treasuries and diplomatic alliances could not. Her life proved that courage and principle could triumph over overwhelming odds, even when that triumph came at the ultimate cost. Joan of Arc died at 19, after a public career that lasted less than 2 years. But in that brief time, she accomplished more than most people achieve in a lifetime. She saved France from foreign conquest, established the legitimacy of its monarchy, and created a legacy of resistance to oppression that would inspire people throughout the world for centuries to come. The story of Joan of Arc did not end with her canonization in 1920, any more than it had ended with her execution in 1431. Her legacy continued to evolve, to inspire, and to challenge conventional assumptions about power, faith, and the role of individuals in shaping history. In the century since her official recognition as a saint, Joan has become perhaps the most universally recognized symbol of courage in the face of impossible odds. During World War I, French soldiers carried images of Joan into battle against German invaders. Seeing parallels between her mission to drive out foreign occupiers and their own struggle to defend French soil, the timing of her canonization, just 2 years after the end of the Great War, was not coincidental. Pope Benedict XV recognized that the world needed Joan's example of faith triumphing over despair, of courage conquering fear, of ordinary people achieving extraordinary things when they refused to accept defeat. The Second World War saw Joan's image invoked by both sides of the French political divide. The Vichy government claimed her as a symbol of traditional Catholic France, while the resistance movement saw her as the ultimate symbol of refusal to collaborate with foreign occupation. Charles de Gaulle explicitly compared his call for French resistance to Joan's divine mission, arguing that both represented France's refusal to accept defeat even when all conventional hope was lost. This political appropriation of Joan's legacy raises important questions about how historical figures become symbols that transcend their original historical context. Joan has been claimed by monarchists and republicans, by Catholics and secularists, by feminists and traditionalists, by nationalists and internationalists. Each group finds in her story the elements that support their own vision of what courage and principle should look like in action. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Joan's modern legacy is the way her story continues to challenge assumptions about the relationship between religious faith and political action. In an increasingly secular world, Joan represents the possibility that spiritual conviction can be a source of practical wisdom rather than dangerous delusion. Her life suggests that there might be forms of truth that transcend rational analysis, and forms of courage that depend on faith rather than calculation. Modern historians have subjected Joan's story to intense scrutiny, using advanced techniques to analyze everything from the political context of her rise to the psychological dynamics of her religious experiences. Some scholars have argued that her voices were symptoms of temporal lobe, epilepsy, or other neurological conditions. Others have suggested that her military success was due to superior intelligence gathering rather than divine inspiration. Still others have focused on the political manipulation that surrounded her throughout her career. These scholarly debates are important for understanding the historical Joan of Arc, but they do not diminish the power of her story as a source of inspiration. Whether her voices came from God, from her own unconscious wisdom, or from some combination of psychological and spiritual factors, the results were the same. A teenage peasant girl changed the course of European history through absolute commitment to her convictions. The enduring fascination with Joan's story also reflects modern anxieties about the role of faith in public life. In democracies where political authority is supposed to derive from popular consent rather than divine mandate, Joan's claim to authority based on direct revelation from God seems both inspiring and dangerous. Her story raises questions about when, if ever, individuals have the right to override established political authority based on higher moral or spiritual convictions. These questions have become particularly relevant in an age of global communication, where individuals can achieve international influence without traditional institutional backing. Modern activists, revolutionaries, and reformers often invoke Joan's example to justify their challenges to established authority. Her story has become a template for understanding how moral conviction can create political power, even when it lacks conventional resources or support. But Joan's legacy also serves as a warning about the costs of absolute conviction. Her refusal to compromise on her principles ultimately led to her death, and her story raises difficult questions about when faithfulness to ideals becomes destructive to the very causes those ideals are meant to serve. The peasant girl who saved France also demonstrates how the same qualities that enable extraordinary achievement can lead to tragic destruction. The feminist movement has found particular inspiration in Joan's example, seeing in her story proof that gender need not limit human achievement when conviction is strong enough to overcome social barriers. Joan's insistence on wearing male clothing, commanding armies, and claiming political authority directly challenged medieval assumptions about women's roles in ways that continue to resonate with modern struggles for gender equality. Yet Joan's relationship with feminist ideology is complicated by her own statements about her mission and her role. She consistently claimed that her authority came not from any inherent right or capability, but from divine calling that transcended normal human categories. She did not argue that women, in general, should have military or political authority, only that God had chosen her specifically for a particular mission that required her to transcend conventional gender roles. This tension between Joan's example and her ideology reflects broader questions about how historical figures should be interpreted across cultural and temporal boundaries. Joan lived in a world with radically different assumptions about gender, authority, religion, and politics than our own. Using her story to support modern political positions requires careful attention to the differences between the values she actually held and the values we might like her to have held. Perhaps the most important lesson of Joan's legacy is the way it demonstrates both the power and the limitations of individual action in shaping historical events. Joan accomplished extraordinary things, but she did so within a specific historical context that made her achievements possible. Her success depended not just on her own courage and conviction, but on the political desperation of Charles VII, the military situation in France, the popular religious culture of medieval Christianity, and countless other factors beyond her control. This historical context does not diminish Joan's achievement, but it does suggest that understanding her legacy requires attention to the complex interactions between individual agency and structural circumstances. Joan changed history, but she could only change it in the ways that the historical moment allowed. Her story is both an inspiration to individual action and a reminder of how that action is always shaped by forces beyond any single person's control. As we look back on Joan of Arc's life, nearly 6 centuries after her death, what stands out is not just her extraordinary achievements, but the very ordinariness of her origins and the universality of the challenges she faced. She was a teenager trying to make sense of experiences that seemed to transcend normal human understanding. She was a person of deep faith, trying to discern the difference between divine calling and personal delusion. She was an individual with strong convictions, trying to navigate a world of political compromise and moral ambiguity. These are not uniquely medieval challenges. They are human challenges that every generation must face in its own way. Joan's story continues to resonate because it speaks to universal questions about courage, faith, integrity, and the possibility of changing the world through individual action. Her life suggests that ordinary people, faced with extraordinary circumstances, can achieve things that seem impossible as long as they are willing to pay the price that such achievement requires. And so we reach the end of our journey through the brutal, beautiful, and ultimately triumphant life of Joan of Arc. We began with a 17-year-old peasant girl standing in white armor on a blood-soaked battlefield, and we end with a saint whose story has inspired millions across the centuries. But the distance between those two images, the journey from Domremy to eternal fame, was paved with more suffering, courage, and sheer human determination than any single life should have to contain. Joan's story is ultimately about the price of refusing to accept the world as it is. She could have lived quietly in her village, married a local farmer, raised children, and died unknown to history. Instead, she chose to believe that the voices she heard were real, that God had chosen her for an impossible mission, and that faith could triumph over every form of earthly power arrayed against it. That choice cost her everything, including her life, but it also transformed her from a historical footnote into one of the most influential figures in human history. The brutality of Joan's life was not accidental. It was the inevitable result of trying to change a world that profits from staying the same. Medieval France was not a romantic fairy tale kingdom. It was a society built on violence, inequality, and the systematic oppression of anyone who challenged established authority. Joan's mission required her to confront every aspect of this system, from the military power that enforced it, to the religious authorities that legitimized it, to the political structures that perpetuated it. What makes Joan's story so compelling is not just that she succeeded in changing this world, but that she did so while maintaining her humanity, her compassion, and her moral integrity. She wept over the bodies of her enemies, even as she defeated them in battle. She refused to compromise her principles, even when compromise might have saved her life. She treated kings and peasants with the same directness and honesty, because she understood that all human authority was temporary, while divine truth was eternal. The dark humor in Joan's story lies in the gap between the extraordinary nature of her achievements and the ordinary human weaknesses of the people she had to work with. She was a saint, trying to save a kingdom full of sinners, a visionary trying to implement divine will through very human institutions, a teenage girl trying to convince grown men to act on faith rather than fear. The wonder is not that she sometimes failed, but that she succeeded as much as she did. But perhaps the most brutal aspect of Joan's life was the way success itself became a trap. Her victories at Orleans and Reims made her indispensable to the French cause, which meant she lost the freedom to follow her voices wherever they might lead. Her fame made her a target for every enemy of France, which meant she could never again live safely in the world she had helped to create. Her absolute faith made compromise impossible, which meant she was doomed to eventual conflict with the political pragmatists who surrounded her. The tragedy of Joan's execution was not just that an innocent person died, but that the very people who benefited most from her sacrifices were the ones who abandoned her when her continued existence became inconvenient. Charles VII owed his crown to Joan's courage, but he made no serious effort to save her when she was captured. The French nobility owed their restoration to Joan's victories, but they were secretly relieved when the English solved the problem of her growing independence. The church that would eventually canonize her as a saint condemned her as a heretic when political pressures made her martyrdom expedient. Yet, even in death, Joan achieved a victory that none of her enemies could have anticipated. By burning her as a witch, the English transformed her from a successful military commander into an eternal symbol of resistance to oppression. By documenting her trial so thoroughly, her judges provided future generations with detailed evidence of her courage, her faith, and her intellectual sophistication under pressure. By trying to erase her physical remains, her executioners made every trace of her presence sacred to those who believed in her mission. Joan's canonization in 1920 was not just a recognition of her sanctity. It was an acknowledgement that her story had transcended its original historical context to become a universal inspiration. She had become a symbol of the possibility that ordinary people, armed with extraordinary faith, could change the world in ways that armies and treasuries could not. Her life had proven that courage and principle could triumph over overwhelming odds, even when that triumph came at the ultimate cost. But perhaps the most important lesson of Joan's story is that true victory often looks like defeat from the perspective of conventional wisdom. She died young, abandoned by her friends, condemned by her enemies, and apparently defeated by the very forces she had tried to overcome. Yet her death accomplished more than her life ever could have, inspiring centuries of resistance to tyranny and proving that some truths are too powerful to be destroyed by those who fear them. Joan of Arc was 19 years old when she burned in the market square at Rouen. She had been active on the stage of European history for less than 2 years. Her entire military career lasted barely 16 months. Yet in that brief span, she saved a kingdom, legitimized a dynasty, changed the course of a century-long war, and created a legacy that continues to inspire people nearly 600 years later. The peasant girl who heard voices in her father's garden became a saint whose story transcends every barrier of time, culture, language, and religion. She proved that the most unlikely people could accomplish the most extraordinary things when they refused to accept that the impossible was actually impossible. She demonstrated that faith, courage, and absolute commitment to principle could overcome every form of worldly power, even when the cost of that victory was life itself. Joan of Arc's life was brutal because changing the world is always brutal. It requires a willingness to suffer for abstract principles, to sacrifice personal happiness for larger causes, and to maintain hope in the face of overwhelming despair. But Joan's story also proves that this brutality is not meaningless, that the suffering required to change the world can produce transformations that justify every sacrifice and inspire every generation that comes after. Tonight, nearly 6 centuries after a teenage peasant girl first heard voices telling her to save France, her story continues to challenge us to examine our own lives for moments when we might be called to impossible missions of our own. We may not hear literal voices from saints, but we all face moments when we must choose between safety and principle, between compromise and conviction, between accepting the world as it is and fighting to make it what it should be. Joan's legacy is not just that she succeeded in her impossible mission, but that she showed us what human beings are capable of when they refuse to let fear, doubt, or conventional wisdom limit their response to the call of conscience. She proved that the gap between what is and what should be can be bridged by individuals willing to pay whatever price that bridge might require. In the end, Joan of Arc's life was so brutal precisely because it was so beautiful. Beauty, real beauty, always costs more than we expect to pay. But as Joan's story proves, sometimes that cost is the only price that can purchase the kind of transformation the world desperately needs. Her brutality was the world's brutality, reflected back at those who created it. Her beauty was God's beauty, made manifest through the most unlikely person at the most impossible time in the most desperate circumstances imaginable. And that, perhaps, is the most important truth Joan's story has to teach us, that divine beauty and human brutality are not opposites, but partners in the dance of transformation that moves the world from what it is toward what it is meant to be. Joan of Arc lived that dance, died that dance, and became eternal through that dance. Her story was brutal because changing the world is always brutal, but it was also beautiful because changing the world is always beautiful. The voices that spoke to Joan in Domremy are still speaking today to anyone willing to listen, to anyone brave enough to act, to anyone faithful enough to pay whatever price transformation might require. Joan heard them and answered, and in doing so, became not just a saint, but a permanent reminder that the impossible is only impossible until someone refuses to believe it.